American bunker buster bombs shatter the earth deep beneath the mountains. 9 million terrified citizens pack whatever they can carry and flee the capital, clogging the highways leading north. The crown jewels of a nation's nuclear ambitions are reduced to smoking craters. By every conventional measure of modern warfare, the United States and Israel have just delivered a crippling, decisive blow. But then the dust settles. A ceasefire is signed. And something impossible happens. The Iranian president steps in front of the national television cameras, looks directly at his people, and calls the devastation of his country a major victory. The supreme leader stands up and tells the world that the American attacks achieved absolutely nothing. If you are sitting at home watching the evening news, you probably laughed. You see the rubble and wonder how a regime whose cities are emptying out can claim they just beat the United States. But here is the chilling reality that the analysts and the anchors are completely missing. They might actually be right. Today we are going to walk you through exactly how surviving the deadliest military machine in human history is the ultimate strategic triumph. We are going to expose how Washington might have just celebrated a ceasefire that is actually a devastating long-term defeat for the American empire. To understand why Washington might be walking directly into a trap, you have to understand the mind of the enemy. If you look strictly at the annual defense budgets, the math is incredibly simple. The United States spends hundreds of billions of dollars. Iran spends a tiny fraction of that. In a conventional head-to-head war on an open battlefield, the American military wipes them off the map. But the military architects in Tehran know this. They never planned to fight a conventional war. Instead, over the course of decades, they built something entirely different. They built the axis of resistance: Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, heavily armed militias operating deep inside Iraq and Syria. Think of this sprawling network not as a traditional standing army, but as a lethal swarm. A single bee cannot kill a bear, but a swarm of 1,000 bees stinging constantly, relentlessly, from every possible direction can make the bear suffer. They can make the colossal beast exhausted, disoriented, and completely unable to hunt anywhere else. This is the dark art of the asymmetric bleed. This strategic objective was never to defeat the United States military in a glorious final battle. The objective is to keep America trapped. The goal is to force the Pentagon to constantly deploy massive aircraft carriers, launch million-dollar interceptor missiles, and burn through endless piles of American taxpayer money simply to maintain the status quo. Once east, Washington desperately wants to pivot. They want to pack up and focus their vast military might on the rapidly rising geopolitical threats of China and Russia, but the swarm will not let them leave. The swarm keeps stinging. Iran is perfectly content to absorb the heavy bombings if it means keeping the American empire permanently stuck in the desert sands, slowly but surely bleeding its financial resources and its political will until the superpower simply cannot sustain the fight. In June 2025, the long shadow war finally erupts into the open. The skies over the Middle East are completely torn apart. The Israeli military launches what they call Operation Rising Lion. From their perspective, this is the precise, devastating moment they have been preparing for over decades. More than 200 fighter jets launch into the air, flying an astonishing 25,000 sorties in just 12 days. They strike more than 100 Iranian facilities. Nuclear sites, military compounds, and command centers are systematically pulverized. Key scientists and top military commanders are eliminated in precision strikes. But the swarm immediately strikes back. Iran unleashes Operation True Promise 3, an assault of staggering proportions. 550 heavy ballistic missiles and 1,000 suicide drones are fired directly at Israel in that same 12-day window. The evening news will tell you that the defense grid held that 90% of the incoming fire was successfully intercepted. But in modern warfare, 90% is absolutely not enough. 31 heavy missiles tear right through the advanced defense shield. They annihilate a major power station. They strike a critical oil refinery in Haifa, and they hit a university. 28 Israelis are killed, almost all of them civilians. Over 3,000 people are severely injured, and more than 9,000 citizens are displaced from their ruined homes. The devastation on the Iranian side is even more catastrophic. Between 160 to 190 Iranians are killed by the relentless Israeli bombardment, with nearly 5,000 left bleeding and wounded in the rubble. And then These are not just dry statistics on a Pentagon briefing slide. This is the horrific, bleeding reality of what happens when advanced, high-tech military powers finally collide. It is a terrifying glimpse into the abyss, a mutual slaughter that sets the stage for a massive geopolitical earthquake. On June 23rd, the conflict violently breaches an unspoken red line. Iran launches 14 ballistic missiles directly at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. You must understand the gravity of this target. Al Udeid is not a random desert outpost. It is the beating heart and the central nervous system of the United States military presence in the Middle East. By pure luck or careful calculation, not a single American is killed. But what happens next in Washington completely rewrites the global balance of power. The President of the United States takes to social media. Instead of declaring a fierce retaliation for a direct ballistic strike on American forces, Donald Trump publicly thanks Iran. He dismisses the strike as a very weak response and immediately signals that it is time to make a deal. Within hours, the White House is aggressively brokering a ceasefire. But the true geopolitical earthquake happens behind closed doors between Washington and Jerusalem. The Israeli military is fueled and ready, actively preparing a massive, devastating retaliatory strike to finish the job. And the United States steps in to stop them. The most powerful empire on the planet exerts immense diplomatic pressure on its closest ally to stand down. Bowing to Washington, Israel cancels the massive assault and ends up hitting only a single radar site near Tehran, a mere fraction of what was planned. You have to pause and ask yourself a critical question. Why does the undisputed global hegemon flinch? Why does the United States talk Israel down from the ledge instead of finishing the fight? Because the strategists in Washington looked into the abyss of a full-scale regional war and blinked. They realized that an all-out conflict would bankrupt the treasury, shatter the global economy, and destroy any chance of pivoting their forces to Asia. The decision to leash their own ally broadcasted a terrifying reality to the rest of the world. Washington fears the devastating cost of an endless war far more than it desires a definitive military victory. The politicians in Washington are lining up at the podiums, claiming they successfully dismantled the threat. They are actively selling the American public a narrative of absolute victory based solely on the number of concrete buildings they turned to ash. But if you look closely at the geopolitical scoreboard, you will see a devastating strategic defeat. The United States and Israel went into this conflict with an explicit public goal: devastate the military and permanently eliminate the nuclear capabilities. They certainly did serious physical damage. There is no question about that. But the Islamic Republic of Iran is still standing. The supreme leader is still firmly in charge. The government absolutely did not collapse. From the perspective of a regime that has always defined itself as a persecuted minority, willing to sacrifice and endure, merely surviving a direct, unmitigated assault from the world's most powerful military is not political spin. It is a genuine victory. But the second failure is far worse, and it directly threatens the safety of the entire world. The primary justification for unleashing American bunker buster bombs was to halt Iran's nuclear ambitions. Yet look at the immediate catastrophic aftermath of the ceasefire. The Iranian parliament immediately convenes and officially votes to end all cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Furthermore, they publicly signal that they may leave the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty entirely. Think about what that actually means for the future. The United States entered this massive conflict with a damaged Iranian nuclear program that was still being actively monitored by international inspectors. They exit this conflict with absolutely zero oversight. The security cameras are permanently cut. The international inspectors are kicked out. Washington used a blunt, devastating military hammer to solve a highly complex political problem, and in doing so, they completely blinded themselves. Iran now has less international nuclear oversight than it had before a single American bomb was dropped. In the long run, operating entirely in the dark without any global constraints is a massive leap forward for their nuclear ambitions. How can any serious analyst look at that terrifying reality and call it an American win? For years, politicians in Washington have sold the American public a comforting story. They promised that the United States was finally pivoting away from the Middle East. The grand strategy was to reduce the military footprint, bring the soldiers home, and focus the immense power of the Pentagon entirely on the Pacific. But look at the map in 2024, long before the first bunker buster was ever dropped. The United States already had more than 10,000 troops heavily entrenched across Bahrain, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. Add to that two massive aircraft carrier strike groups constantly patrolling the hostile waters. That does not look like an empire packing its bags. That looks like an empire deeply chained to the sand. Now, look at the grim reality after the massive escalations and the so-called victorious ceasefire of 2025. The politicians are taking their televised victory laps, proudly boasting about the destruction of Iranian infrastructure. But what exactly is their grand prize? The prize is a permanent, inescapable quagmire. By the dawn of 2026, the United States is more deeply entangled in the Middle East than at any point in recent history. They are desperately forced to deploy more troops, rush more aircraft carriers to the coast, and conduct endless high-stakes diplomatic missions just to keep the fragile region from completely detonating. Washington is now bleeding tens of billions of taxpayer dollars every single year just to maintain tens of thousands of American soldiers in a boiling cauldron. They thought they were dropping bombs to permanently solve a security problem so they could finally leave. Instead, the Pentagon walked blindly into the exact strategic trap that the Iranian military spent decades carefully building. The American military is now hopelessly stuck, hemorrhaging national treasure and strategic attention, while their true global adversaries quietly watch and prepare. By early 2026, the fragile illusions of containment completely evaporate. The United States and Israel are openly at war with Iran. But as the world frantically watches the skies for incoming ballistic missiles, the strategists in Tehran look down at the water. They are preparing to play their most devastating card, and it is not a nuclear weapon, it is pure geography. Welcome to the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow, winding waterway in the Persian Gulf is the ultimate geopolitical choke point. The statistics are absolutely terrifying for any Western defense planner. 20% of all the oil consumed on Earth flows through this exact channel every single day, along with roughly 20% of the global supply of liquefied natural gas. It is the absolute lifeblood of the modern industrial world, and it is completely exposed. In a calculated move designed to shatter the global economy, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officially declares the strait closed. They issue a stark, uncompromising threat to the international community. Any vessel attempting passage will be set ablaze. This is not a diplomatic bluff. The waters immediately turn violent. Heavily armed fast boats and coastal missile batteries enforce the blockade. At least 5 massive oil tankers are severely damaged. 2 sailors are killed in the chaos. Suddenly, a staggering fleet of 150 massive cargo ships are stranded at sea, completely paralyzed by the threat of destruction. In a matter of hours, more than 90% of normal oil and refined product flows through the region are violently blocked. Think about the terrifying asymmetry of this exact moment. A nation that has been heavily sanctioned by the West for decades, a nation whose military infrastructure has just been relentlessly bombed by the most advanced stealth fighters on the planet, now suddenly holds its hand directly over the kill switch of the entire global economy. They do not need to sink an American aircraft carrier to bring Washington to its knees. They only need to stop the ships. The fires burning in the Persian Gulf do not stay in the Middle East. They travel across the ocean and land directly in the living rooms of the American public. You might not care about the geopolitical chess matches being played in locked rooms thousands of miles away, but you are going to pay for them every single day. When the Strait of Hormuz is choked off, the global energy markets spiral into absolute panic. Oil prices do not just climb, they violently explode. By April 2026, Brent crude rockets past $110 a barrel. United States domestic crude hits $113. Wall Street analysts look at the burning tankers and frantically warn their clients that prices could easily reach $150 if the blockade holds. The International Energy Agency, the global organization whose sole purpose is to stabilize energy markets, hits the ultimate panic button. In a desperate attempt to slow the economic bleeding, they are forced to release a staggering 400 million barrels of emergency crude reserves. It is a historic, unprecedented flood of oil, but it barely slows the hemorrhage. Now, step away from the trading floors and look at Main Street. Look at the local gas stations across the United States. Every single time an American driver steps out of their car to fill their tank, they are personally paying for the fallout of a failed foreign policy. The retired couple living on a fixed income, the working family struggling to buy groceries, the small business owner running a delivery fleet. They are the ones absorbing the true, suffocating cost of this conflict. The war is no longer a distant abstraction televised on the evening news. It is a crushing, daily tax on American survival. Washington chose to escalate a shadow war, but the American working class was violently forced to foot the bill. As the global economy begins to suffocate, the Pentagon responds the only way it knows how, with overwhelming physical force. Thousands of elite Marines and paratroopers from the legendary 82nd Airborne Division are rapidly deployed into the burning theater, piling on top of the massive forces already heavily entrenched across the region. The United States prepares for an apocalyptic confrontation, but behind the scenes of this massive military buildup, a very different, deeply humiliating reality is quietly unfolding in the shadows of international diplomacy. The United States, the undisputed military hegemon of the world, is forced to quietly hand a 15-point ceasefire proposal to diplomats in Pakistan, begging them to act as a go-between with Tehran. The offer is an act of sheer economic desperation. Washington asks Iran to accept theoretical limits on its nuclear program and restrictions on its vast missile stockpile. In exchange, the United States offers sweeping sanctions relief, practically pleading for Iran to guarantee the free, safe passage of oil ships through the Strait of Hormuz. The response from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is swift and uncompromising. They reject the American proposal outright, but they do not just say no, they send back a devastating counterproposal that completely shatters the long-standing illusion of Western dominance. Iran demands that the United States formally recognize absolute Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, and they brazenly demand that Washington pay massive financial war reparations for the damages inflicted by American bombs. Look at the terrifying shift in the global balance of power. You have a superpower that just spent billions of dollars deploying the most advanced airborne divisions, stealth bombers, and aircraft carriers on the planet, desperately passing notes through third-party intermediaries just to beg a crippled, heavily bombed nation to let the cargo ships sail. Now you must ask yourself the ultimate, defining question of this entire conflict. When the smoke clears and the ships are burning, who actually holds the leverage in that negotiation? The United States went into this shadow war with overwhelming firepower and a single, unified objective: eliminate the Iranian threat and stabilize the Middle East. But look at the brutal reality of the aftermath. Oil is trading at $110 a barrel, draining the wallets of American families. The American military is hopelessly chained to the desert. 6 American soldiers are coming home in flag-draped transfer cases. And Iran, the very nation Washington swore to disarm, has completely severed its advancing nuclear program from all international oversight. But the most terrifying consequence of this ceasefire is not happening in the Middle East. It is happening in Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang. The global adversaries of the United States are watching this theater very closely. They just watched a heavily sanctioned, isolated nation absorb the absolute terrifying force of American and Israeli air power and survive. The ultimate illusion of American deterrence has been permanently shattered. The rest of the world now knows that Washington fears the economic devastation of a prolonged war far more than it desires a definitive military victory. You can drop the most advanced bombs on Earth. You can claim a flawless tactical victory on the evening news. But a tactical victory on the battlefield can never compensate for a catastrophic, irreversible strategic defeat on the global stage.